Hello. Um, I am going to start talking about Book 5 here. I know it's been a while since I've made a lecture video. It's hard to find a place to do that, but I finally was able to reserve a spot. We're in Book 5 of Plato's Republic, and just to dive in, um, something very odd happens at the very beginning of Book 5, doesn't it? It should seem a little reminiscent, in fact, of a similar scene. Socrates is getting ready to launch into another discussion, something that he'll actually talk about in Book 8 eventually, just to let you know. Um, when he's interrupted again, uh, this time by basically the whole group of young men that he is with. Socrates has been discussing the virtues in Book 4, and it's important to keep that in mind as we look at Book 5. Um, if you remember, the four virtues are wisdom, which is knowledge of the whole, courage, which is the preservation of correct belief regarding what should and should not be feared, temperance or moderation, which is a certain mastery and ordering of one's desires, and then justice, which is where each part of the soul and or city does only its job and does not interfere in the job of another. And that kind of turns out to be a certain harmony within the soul between the different parts, with the idea that if the individual soul is harmonized and this individual soul over here, let's say, is harmonized, now harmony is truly possible here at the social level. Now true friendship, including political friendship, is possible. And so that's the idea here. Um, so we've traversed quite a bit of ground. Book 1 was a preface, if you remember, trying to define what is justice. And we had some real difficulties with that initially, as you know. And we ended, ironically, without defining justice, but um, but nevertheless seeming to show that justice is still better than injustice, which is the opposite of what Thrasymachus wanted to argue. Um, Book 2 opens with a series of problems, as you know. I won't go into, you know, the details there. Glaucon lays out his sense of the problem, right? All with a all with a sense of trying to ask this question: is justice an intrinsic good? Is it ever an intrinsic good? Is it possible to seek justice for its own sake, even in the face of tremendous suffering, right? Remember, Glaucon defines justice there at the beginning of Book 2 as the fear of suffering injustice outweighing the desire to get away with injustice. And he says that's why we have laws and covenants. And he tries to prove it by showing two stories where justice seems to falter, right? First, by temptation because of the ring of Gyges. Secondly, through the problem of suffering, right? To a point where justice uh, gives up and because it does not want to suffer anymore. The just man who's perceived as unjust goes through all these horrible sufferings and it doesn't seem to really pay off, right? Adimantus presents his problem, the contradictory stories. He lays out his own sense of the problem of suffering. Why does a good God give bad fates to good people? He looks at the problem of appearance and reality, where appearance seems to count for more than reality, right? Then we had the whole problem of the two cities, um, the city of necessity, seeming to be much more just, but yet for most people not very exciting. Uh, on the other hand, the city of luxury is much more exciting, And there are all these things going on that seem to satisfy our desires, those mad masters, right, that we talked about very early on in book one, right? And yet it is not a just city. In fact, it's a city that constantly has to deal with the injustice in it that is driven by uncontrolled desire, right? Then we get to the problem of storytelling and what stories are we going to tell our guardians? Do we need to censor these stories so that our guardians become good guardians? And we look at different kinds of music. What effects do they have on the soul? And different kinds of stories and tragedy and comedy and what do all these different kinds of genres, different kinds of music, different kinds of storytelling, different kinds of content, different forms, what effects do they have on the soul? Do they make us more ordered or more disordered? Okay, so that's the problem of storytelling and just basic cultural issues. Youth showing respect to elders or not. If they do, we have a more stable society. If they don't, suddenly we have problems, it seems, right? For Socrates at least. And then book three ends with the noble lie, right? This attempt on Socrates' part to get things back under control again, right? And we're going to have golden guardians, silver auxiliaries who are, by as their name indicates, they're going to help the guardians, right? Um, uh, Enforce the laws that the guardians craft, right? On the rest of the city, known as the craftsmen, right? The craftsmen and the farmers. Uh, the guardians are supposed to be pursuers of wisdom, the auxiliaries pursuers of courage. And in order for this city to work, the craftsmen have to be pursuers of temperance or moderation, right? But if they are also pursuing profit and money and wealth and private property and all of this sort of thing, isn't that going to create a lot of disorder in them to the point where they're not going to want to listen to what the guardians have to say? We have a problem, in other words, in the noble eye with two different constitutions, two different makeups of our city. The guardian auxiliary group and versus the craftsmen, right? And it's a situation that's ripe for civil war, for rebellion and revolution, any number of things like that. Well, that's when Socrates then veers back towards looking at the individual soul. And he talks about the virtues, which I've just reviewed, right? Wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice, right? And it would seem that if these virtues are truly in place in our city, then we can hope to have a good life once again, right? Um, and we can have harmony not only within, but harmony between, right? Book 5 changes everything again. Why? These young men have been thinking about something Socrates said back in book 3 for quite a while now, obviously. And that's when he said that guardians should share everything together. Why is Socrates saying this? Well, if you remember the 5 conditions that the guardians must adhere to if they want to be guardians, there are 5 total. And I'll write these again on the board, okay? See if I can position this a little better. The first one, the first condition for becoming a guardian is the guardian must agree to receiving and accruing or collecting no wealth. He or she is not allowed to collect wealth or money of any kind. And along with that, these two kind of go together. They're not even allowed to have any private property whatsoever. This is very important. This is what's getting played out in book 5. No money privately. They don't get private stashes of wealth, and no private property. Okay? And in fact, uh, they also are not allowed to receive any private honor whatsoever. This is important. This is made clear back with the noble lie. And this is again going to play a role in Book 5. Um, None of the guardians, regardless of what kind of work they do, let's say Hank, our guardian, comes up with this great law, and it's implemented throughout the city won't know. The guardians will be praised. They are, after all, the golden class. The guardians will be praised, but only as a class. The honor will all be received as a class or as a group, not privately. No one is allowed to be raised above any of the other guardians. And you can kind of see the idea behind that, right? Trying to avoid internal disharmony here, internal conflict, right? Okay, so, um, well, it gets even sharper and deeper. If you read the conditions once again, uh, no privacy whatsoever is allowed to the guardians, which seems just crazy. But the idea there is, when do people normally commit injustice? Let's go back to Thrasymachus. What are the two powers available to the unjust man? Force, and he says the utilization of covert means, a fancy way of saying deception, right? In other words, injustice usually takes place behind closed doors, in secret, in private. So we're going to remove privacy from the guardian class. By the way, the auxiliaries have to agree to this too, just so that's clear, because of their task of enforcing what the guardians say. They have to agree to all of this too, even though they're the silver class. Okay, so that's a really, and you'll see how that plays out in just a minute. The fifth one is all they receive for compensation. So this is a positive condition in the sense of this is what they're not allowed to have. This is what they're allowed to have. Their compensation is room and board. That's it. They're given the basics like soldiers in an army camp. They're given a place to stay. They don't have to pay for it. They don't have any money. They're given food and whatever other necessities, thinking of the city of necessity again. And that's it. And they do get the highest honor. They get the highest honor as the gold class, but only as a class, never privately, never individually. So, for many people, I'm trying to imagine anyone who would agree to these conditions. Again, I think Plato, through Socrates, is imposing tests on us again to get us to think about the problem rather than necessarily offering a totally serious, practical solution. This doesn't seem practical, does it? So, well, Book 5 opens, and in fact, I'll just jump right to it. It seems to me that what's going on in Book 5 is very much of what happens at the very beginning of the book itself in Book 1. When Polemarchus gets some guys to gather around him and they bully Socrates at Glaucon into staying at the Piraeus rather than going back home to Athens. They interrupt Socrates. I think I've said before previously, anytime you see an interruption like this in the text, red flag has to go up. Something very important dramatically is going on in the text. And that's exactly what happens here. Usually it's a change in direction of the dialogue, and that's exactly what happens here. That's what happened with Thrasymachus's interruption way back in Book 1. We had Glaucon's interruption of Socrates' city of necessity. We've had some other interruptions. This one's another big one. Socrates even says that it feels like you're taking us back to the beginning, right? And so that's this is a very important dramatic moment. Thrasymachus even joins in as well. And what they want to know is, what did you mean, Socrates, when you said the guardians share everything, including spouses and children? You can kind of tell what they're really concerned about. If I can be facetious for just a moment, I'm not trying to be offensive. I know it's easy to be offensive these days. It's kind of one of the things that makes life so hard now. But what are they interested in? They're interested in the sex lives of the guardians. Well, they're young men though, right? Why wouldn't they be, right? That's what they want to know. Socrates explained, if there's no privacy and all this other stuff is shared, explain how this is going to work, right? So, because there's no privacy and we need to guard the guardians, so to speak, and watch over them, even though they're supposed to be the just ones, yeah, how's that going to play out? Well, that's why Socrates launches into the discussion he does. And they gang up on him again. He's being kind of almost intellectually bullied at this point. You can tell there's some anger here and that sort of thing. And Socrates has to talk about things that he says he doesn't really want to talk about. And when you read Book 5, you can see that Book 5 is structured on three things that I'm going to write on the board. Wish these boards were a lot bigger. Socrates organizes his discussion in Book 5, his dialogue, around three waves that might overcome the ship of our city. That's a later metaphor for the city. The ship of fools is what it's known as in Book 6. And we've got three waves. The first wave that he talks about that takes him a little while to kind of get to, because he knows he's dealing with young men, so he's not quite sure how to proceed here. But this has to do with gender. I'm sure you picked up on it. This has to do with gender. And the way Socrates puts it is, he asserts the possibility that maybe men and women have the same nature. There's not any essential difference or differences between men and women. We're talking about this right now, aren't we, in our culture? See how relevant this is? And except for maybe some minor differences in physicality, right, that Glaucon mentions and is mentioned a couple of other times, Socrates says, well, shouldn't we treat men and women exactly the same? We should treat them the same, and because they have the same nature. We should have the same expectations of them. In other words, we need women to become guardians too, obviously, right? We need them to become guardians too. This is the wave of gender. And the second wave is arrived at by applying number 1 plus the no privacy rule, that guardians cannot have, the guardians cannot have the any if they can't have any privacy, that means they can't have private families either, right? This is my family. Here's my son. Here's my daughter. Here's my wife. Here's my husband, etc. Here's my brother. Here's my sister. My. See, that's private. That there's something almost property-like with that, right? So we're going to publicize entirely, if that makes sense. We're going to publicize entirely the life of the guardian, for men and women both. And so, number two, these three waves, these three proposals, I'm going to put the word proposal here too. These three proposals that Socrates makes. The second one is that everything will be shared by the guardians, including spouses and children. Including spouses and children. And when you read all of the propositions that come under this, all of the craziness that results, because if you can't allow people to form families, if we have to obliterate, entirely eliminate the family for the guardians in order for them to have a truly public life. After all, they're supposed to be serving the city, right? They shouldn't have any private lives, right? When you look at some of the separate and distinct propositions that come underneath this second proposal, I mean, how do we avoid incest, for example? God, I was wearing this. How do we avoid incest? Some of the guardians are going to have to actually keep track of a secret calendar so we know who's related to whom. Otherwise, down the road, we may have incest, right? Socrates talks about, won't some of the guardians nevertheless rise more to the top than others? And shouldn't they mate with the female guardians who've also risen to the top? The best should mate with the best so we can produce the best. What is that proposal? We know that's a famous, an infamous E word, eugenics, right? Eugenics. This is eugenics. Socrates proposes that any child that's born to the guardians that's too weak should be put away. Technically, he's talking about infanticide. And the craziness just continues on and on, as you know. Our guardians are supposed to be focused on ruling, not some of them keeping a secret calendar, to make sure that we know who's related to whom and that sort of thing. Our guardians are supposed to be focused on ruling the city wisely, not on mating with the best or something like that, right? What's Socrates up to here? That's the question, right? In fact, Book 5 reads so differently from Book 4. Book 4 is this beautiful portrait of what the virtuous life looks like for the individual soul and then by extension, the city, the society. With wisdom in the intellect or in reason, courage in the spirit, temperance in our desires, our appetites, and then justice, maintaining order, all the order between them, producing this harmonious soul, this musical soul, and by extension, a musical city. This seems to be very clangish and disharmonious and crazy and, quite frankly, against the nature of things, right? What's going on? What do you think's going on? This is interesting. It's very interesting. So, Wave 2 and wave 1 kind of go together, obviously. Um, the gender question, and then the sharing everything question. I don't have time to talk about the third wave right now, but I'm going to mention it. And then I'm going to make one more comment, and then we'll end for now. Socrates says the philosophers should be rulers, and the rulers should be philosophers. The philosophers should rule. Think about that. Philosophers should rule. Philosophers? You mean those nerdy guys who want to think all the time? And the rulers should become philosophers. And Socrates actually calls this the biggest wave. Most people, I think, would say number 2 is the biggest wave. I don't know. What do you think? But this is really crazy if you think about it. Imagine if we made our politicians philosophize on a regular basis, become truly reflective as part of their job description. For one thing, this seems to violate the one man, one craft rule, but we're violating that right and left in this proposal as well. I've only got a few minutes before this library closes. I'm going to show you real quickly what I think is happening in terms of what Plato through Socrates is implying here with these 3 waves. I'm going to get it. Hopefully does this work? Yeah. I think each of these waves reveals a fundamental tension in any society, in any body politic, in any polis. Polis is the Greek word for political body or entity, where we get the word political from, or politics. The first wave is the gender wave. It's the tension, and I'm gonna erase this so I can write off. That's why I left myself a little room on this. Here, this is the tension between male and female. Okay? Let's face it, men and women don't always get along. And maybe that's because our natures are not exactly the same. That's something we need to think about at least. Okay? How many women would agree to some of the crazy propositions that come underneath the second wave, after all? I don't know. It's something to think about. So, that's, make this a little smaller so it doesn't take up quite so much space. Okay, number 2, the basic tension is between public and private spheres of human being. We all feel this dichotomy in our lives, I think. We all feel this tension in our lives. There are moments when we have to put on our public self, and then there's our private self. And is this always the same? Often it is not. The public, we express ourselves differently in public than we do in private. And by private too, not just being alone with ourselves, but with our families too, our inner circles. Families, the family life is the private life, right? We talk that way most of the time, right? A politician will leave politics and say, I'm going to spend time with my family, right? I'm going to pursue some private interests for now. The third one has to do with an even more, and maybe this is why Socrates says it's such a fundamental and the biggest of the waves, because it's such a fundamental tension, and that is the tension between wisdom or knowledge, which is what philosophy pursues. That's what it's interested in, when it's true, right? When it's really doing that authentically. Philosophy pursues wisdom or knowledge. What is politics about? Not knowledge, not wisdom, but power. Power. These are often at odds with one another, are they not? The pursuit of wisdom is not the pursuit of power, and vice versa. And so just as we need to marry the male and the female if we're going to form a solid family, We need to learn how to figure out how to marry the public and the private, and the pursuit of wisdom with the pursuit of power. That seems to be the problem here. I would maintain that Socrates is ironically arguing something here. Plato through Socrates is trying to show us that there are these fundamental tensions, these three fundamental tensions in every society.
It is now 7:45. The library will be closing in 15 minutes at 8. The public computers will shut down in 5 minutes. Please let us know if we can be of any assistance.
Yeah, these three tensions fundamentally structure every society. And so if we're going to be just, we have to somehow harmonize these tensions. Is that always possible? I think that's why Book 5 clashes so much with Book 4. Book 4 mainly focused, after all, on the private, on the individual, I think anyway, and the pursuit of virtue. But Book 5 makes everything public again. And in eliminating the private, it seems that possibly it has committed an injustice. Perhaps, right? Think about it. Thank you. I'll be posting this soon. Bye.